Istungo and hello everyone, my name is Turner Hunt. I'm excited to be here today and share a little bit about the Muscogee Creek Nation's history, especially in the state of Mississippi. If I was to introduce myself in the traditional way, I would say Dana Chochifkados, Samalegada Konapogi Does, Momin Amatola Teledegi Does. And I mentioned that my name, my clan, and my tribal town. And my tribal town is Talladega, and I hope that as we move through this presentation, you'll understand a little bit more about that. Here's an outline of what I'd like to accomplish. The purpose is to inform MDH folks of the Muscogee Creek Nation's interest in Mississippi. I'd like to connect the Natchez to the Abika and demonstrate the continuance of their presence in the Muscogee Nation. Last, I'd like to cover the removal routes through Mississippi that facilitated the removal of 20,000 Creek people. This is the Muscogee Creek Nation's most current historic area of interest. As you can see, it is rather large. It is comprised of 12 full and partial states. This is the document that we provide to our consulting partners to make them aware of our interest within the states. This image represents the current historic area of interest within the state of Mississippi, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will understand why the counties are highlighted in such a manner. I wanted to start by focusing on some maps. Maps are very useful in illustrating the past, and since this presentation focuses on our tribal interest within the state of Mississippi, I felt this 1813 map of Mississippi Territory would be an excellent map to start with. There are three main areas I'd like to bring to your attention. Number one is the Natchez homeland, number two is the Chickasaw towns of Chickasaw Nation, and number three is the Upper Creek towns of Muscogee Nation. I've added some dates to assist in illustrating the movement of Natchez refugees over time. I chose the date of 1741 for point 3 as just basically the date that we know that there were Natchez people living within the Muscogee Nation. I hope many of you are familiar with Southwest Mississippi and the ancestral home of the Natchez people. This area will be referred to as the Old Country throughout this representation, but this is where our story begins, in the aftermath of conflict with the French and the continual colonial hostilities that the Natchez people endured. In 1731, there was a reference to a walk of many Natchez and Chickasaw folks headed up to the Chickasaw towns. This may be an indication of a large migration, but there were more than likely already Natchez people living up with the Chickasaw by this time. The Natchez refugees sought protection through the Chickasaw neighbors, as the Chickasaw were powerful enough to check the aggressions of the French and their allies. The Chickasaw were adept traders and had established good relations with the British. This map really actually fails to capture what I'm trying to say. So I think the DeBatte's map of 1737 will be useful here. Dr. Brad Leave's 2008 dissertation focuses on the decade of Chickasaw and Natchez interactions. He does an excellent job of combining archaeology and historic references to narrow the Natchez presence among the Chickasaw. Dr. Leib identifies to the specific site location where Natchez refugees within the Chickasaw towns lived, and most importantly to our story, he covers the exodus from Chickasaw lands, and he provides the date of 1741 as being no more Natchez among the Chickasaw, at least those maintaining a corporate identity. Which brings us back to here. Natchez oral histories say that they requested permission from the Abika to enter the Muscogee Nation, whether that was immediately after the results of their conflict with the French or after their time with the Chickasaw is not immediately clear. But what is clear is that the Abika allowed and welcomed the Natchez to come live within the Muscogee Nation. And this is where this map almost ceases to be useful, as we will be needing to get a little bit more specific. However, there is one last illustration I'd like to show with this map. This map shows a series of roads. It's important to note that, yes, we understand that this is much later in time, but a lot of federal roads and trading paths have been there for centuries, and in the case of the Natchez Trace, perhaps thousands of years. While admitting some of these locations are poorly placed, the map shows the interconnectedness of the lands between the Mississippi River and the Chattahoochee River. Moving on to show possible factors and provide context for the Natchez movement into Creek Nation, I wanted to use this map from 1774. which is titled A Map of British and French Dominions in North America. So what happens is there are two ways of seeing this, and they both lend to tribal agency and their decisions that they sought to benefit their people. The most often found description of breed camp was that it was a Chickasaw trade camp. It is based off the very logical idea that the farther away from Charleston the goods needed to travel, the more they cost. So prices in Creek Nation were often cheaper than those in Chickasaw Nation. So breed camp was established as a transshipment point for English and Chickasaw traders. Another option you may want to consider is that the Natchez people saw an opportunity to move on their own, to live with the Bika, or perhaps even to join others that were already there. They say that the relations with the Chickasaw had become stressed kind of towards the end, but nearly after a decade of living and fighting relatively fierce battles side by side, there were some very strong bonds between the two. So Natchez, in typical Muscogean hospitality lines of reciprocity, that created an opportunity for Chickasaw traders and their families to benefit from trade, and were probably welcome for a number of years. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'd like to highlight that perhaps the Natchez were more instrumental in this process than typically expressed. Years later, about 1772, David Tate noted that at a Natchez and a Bika dance that they were later joined by a group of Chickasaw dancers. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that this relationship between the Natchez and the Chickasaw endured for a long time. This is a map from 1757, and it shows breed camp, or Oweasa, at the top of the map. It is said that other groups describe the Natchez as a race of wizards or conjurers due to their religious rites. But the Natchez themselves said that when they arrived, their ancient manners and customs were so similar to Abika that they had to make no changes at all to their habits. So in essence, what George Stiggins is saying is that the Natchez living with Abika had a great deal of cultural continuity with the old country. So we move on to a trade route of James Adair. He was a British trader who documented his life and travels amongst the tribes of the Southeast. His usual route ran from New Windsor, South Carolina, across the Savannah River from Augusta, then hit a major trade artery to the Tallapoosa towns of the Muscogee Nation. From there, for most of his career, he opted for the longest yet safest route, which turned northwards towards the Creek town of Coosa and passed the nearby Chickasaw breed camp. Swanton notes that the Natchez soon formed their own town after helping establish breed camp, and that breed camp actually was shortly broken up after 1761. I'd also like to just add that this map is used with the permission of the author. This is a military map from Jackson's campaign against the Muscogee Nation. Military maps tend to be more accurate because of the amount of planning that should have been necessary. Jackson was a notorious poor logistician, but that doesn't mean that his maps would have bad data. Swanton writes in 1922 that although having separate towns, the Natchez and Abika are said to have intermarried to such an extent as to become completely fused. Since descent was reckoned through the female line, the Natchez are still distinguishable from Abika through their mothers, and of course the language is also transmitted the same way. I would like to make an additional point that when in the old country, the Natchez had a social mechanism for inclusion of outside groups into the Natchez interaction sphere. It was marriage. Swanton and the others speak about how Natchez intermarried with the Abika or the Cherokee, and they often talk about it as if it was a negative connotation. I would just like to add that even though the Natchez people's role had technically reversed and become refugees, they still relied very heavily on their ancient social mechanisms for inclusion, which were marriage. A couple other points I'd like to make. Fort Talladega wasn't actually called Fort Talladega. It was a fort in Talladega. It was a fort built around the residence of Alexander Leslie. He was the son of a British trader and a Natchez woman, making him Natchez by maternal descent. Fort Chenubby is also on the map. Chenubby is also known as the Great Natchez Warrior, who signed the 1790 Treaty of New York and the 1796 Treaty of Coleraine. So what I'm trying to show here is that the Natchez people could be found all along the Talladega Valley, while also having a very specific township. In fact, Caleb Swan noted in 1791 that the Natchez people were were living in more than one town, and that basically reinforces exactly what I'm trying to say here. I'd like to use one more map to help illustrate, 1823 map, which shows the remnants of the Muscogee Nation land base. If we focus back on the northern part of the Upper Creek Nation, Natchez is still prominently found on maps almost 100 years after leaving the old country. Similarly, Natchez associated sites are still present. I think this would be a good opportunity to explain what Talladega means. If you were to say in Muscogee, you would say Toledegi, and it translates to edge, border, or frontier town. And as you can see, as a consequence of American aggression and the results of the Creek War in 1814, the Coosa River becomes the boundary of Muscogee Nation. And in 1819, it actually becomes the boundary between Muscogee Nation and the new state of Alabama. So this is where I'd like to draw that link between Natchez and Talladega. From Breed Camp to Natchez to Talladega, what are the connections? I think it was neat. I cut out a couple of Swanton census table and removed a couple of bins, put it all together, and it actually kind of helps demonstrate how these towns relate. Additionally, treaty signatories start to cross between Natchez and Talladega, first with Espogo-Harjo and with Esalacta, or more commonly called Salacta, son of Chinobi, the great Natchez warrior. We don't have many images of Natchez in Alabama. Esalacta is one of the few. However, I just wanted to show this to show how his image changes over time. So this concludes the portion of my presentation that is linking the Natchez of Mississippi to the Muscogee Nation and then on to the Talladega tribal town. The next segment covers the removal trails through Mississippi. Creek removal spanned a decade and saw voluntary prisoner and forced removal detachments cleanse the southeast of Muscogee people. The following images come from Dr. Christopher Haven's 2009 dissertation titled The Removal of Creek Indians from the Southeast, 1825 to 1838. As these slides progress, and they cover the decade of ethnic cleansing that saw Muscogee people systematically rounded up and removed from their ancestral homelands, I will take this opportunity to take a moment of silence. Thank you, Mado. My goal is to make this image mean more than just a map with some arrows on it. Throughout removal, some towns coalesced back with their mother towns. Some sought a new identity, while others remained culturally intact and distinct. The way most towns removed together as communities meant that there was a great deal of cultural continuity between Alabama and Indian Territory. This list of towns also provides how we determine our citizenry. Every citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation can trace their lineage back to one of these tribal towns. As we're now at the end, I just want to summarize our talk. Our goal is to discuss different aspects of our tribal history within the state of Mississippi. I've discussed the Natchez and how they are part of our tribe and why we're interested in what occurs at Grand Village or Emerald Mountain or the Anna site, as those are very important and sacred parts of our tribal past. We covered the routes of Indian removal and demonstrated that many, if not all, pass by or through Mississippi. So again, thank you for taking time to listen to me today. I appreciate it. Madochagegaschi.